Welcome to Healthcare IT Today. I'm John Lynn, together with my colleague and friend, Colin Hung. The world of technology and healthcare are ever-changing in new and novel ways, and that's why we love this stuff. So join us as we discuss the latest healthcare and health IT news meshed together in new ways which help generate ideas and new perspectives. Plus, we'll have a little fun along the way. Today, we'll be talking about workforce issues and specifically the problems and benefits of non-competes in healthcare. And be sure to follow the show on social media at the hashtag HITSM and our personal accounts at TechGuy and at Colin_Hung. Plus, check out our 17 years of health IT blog content at healthcareittoday.com. Should I have given you a non-compete, Colin, when you started working with me?
I think I'm located in the state of California, John. So
yeah, I mean, so maybe that's good that we start with our bias. I just fundamentally am like against non-competes for employees. I think one, I need to keep you here, like I need to create an environment that you want to stay here, right? And and I also want what's best for you, and I mean, it's interesting our intro says we're friends, which is true, right? So it's like, if that's what's best for you, and hopefully, the opposite's true too. You won't go try to screw me at some other media company, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess to give the audience a little context of why we're talking about non-competes, I guess the FTC, John, you're saying that they're looking at potentially striking them down and making them not enforceable anymore.
Yeah, that's right. The FTC chair, with a lot of kickback from the Chamber of Commerce and some other large organizations like that, they're exploring. Should we make non-competes illegal? And that those shouldn't be allowed anywhere. As you said, it's already true in California, so we do it. So we'll see if they come through. They submitted, I forget the exact terminology, but they got 20,000 comments on it. So it's going to take them a while to go through all those comments and filter through and decide what to do. But that is going to be, that is where they're pushing, and they're likely to push is to, basically abolish non-competes. Maybe there'll be a few exceptions or something. And then most certainly, if they, and probably when they implement this, it'll then go through legal challenges. Is this allowed? Not the least of which, from what I read, is, the question of, is this a state's issue or is this a national issue? And so that could be one legal framework for it. The other is this anti-competitive? Is this, anyway, I'm not a lawyer, obviously you're not either, but there's all sorts of legal challenges that I think is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court if it does go into effect, because it's such a groundbreaking, important, impactful thing that would impact a lot of companies.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, it's just when you told me, I was like, that's the first thing that popped in my head is like, talk about a historic change, right?
Really?
Like,
is that possible?
yeah, like it would be monumental. But and you're right. I agree. It's going to take a long time for it to wind its way through courts. But I think once you release this genie, it's out. Like, I don't think people will wait for whether it becomes law to start gearing up for the day when this is no longer around, right? Even if, because I doubt, well, anyway, who knows how the Supreme Court would rule, or what the lawyers will do, or what the objections are. But if even this thought got to this level, then companies would be like, man, I got to think of some other way to prevent this from happening. And for example, I think it'll cause a flood of patent applications, right? There'll be more things labeled trade secrets, right, as a way to protect IP. Because you won't be able to, and I got to be honest, like, I don't know if you really could. Like, how many companies were prepared to take a person or a competitor to court over the hiring of another employee? And I'm not talking about like your CTO or like the chief scientist. I get that, but like when it's like a salesperson or like when it's a marketing person, like how many companies were really going to mount that legal objection anyway, right? So in one hand, I look at it and go, the practicality of enforcing it was beyond the means of most small companies anyways. So, it wasn't really that enforceable, even if it was written into the contract.
Well, the hard thing is that a lot of companies are, especially the larger ones, right?
Yes.
Where they just can, and they can throw their weight around, and that's a rounding error on what they're doing. But I think also what's interesting is if it's often the partners and customers of these people that are suffering from these non-competes, because the non-competes don't allow them to go work at the customer. And in one sense, it makes sense, right? Like, hey, I introduced you to the customer, I built the relationship with the customer, and now they're going to poach you away and take you away from me after I trained you and did all this, right? So in one sense, like the non-compete makes sense because that does feel wrong in many senses. And so that's what we see happening, though, is they don't have to even go the legal route. They threaten the legal action to their customer or to their partner who needs a good relationship with that vendor. In the EHR world, if you've spent 100 million, let alone a couple billion, on an EHR, the last thing you want to do is piss off your EHR vendor, right? Like, so, when they come and they say, hey, this person's violating their non-compete, the health systems are kind of hamstrung and they don't really have a choice. Like that person's gone or maybe moved to a new role, but in most cases they're gone. So I think that's the trouble. Like, sure, maybe, just the threat of illegal action, let alone the actual legal action, is enough to stop people from doing it.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's why I say it's historic, right? Because there are, for every case on one end where it's like, oh, this is too small to bother. Like, are you really gonna enforce it on some, I'll call it junior intern that left and going work for a competitor? I doubt anyone would blink an eye at that, right? But you're right. On the other hand, if you spent, a few $100,000 training someone on some specialized software or some specialized methodology, only to have them up and leave to go to a client that they were working on because that was an implementation you were doing, I mean, that sucks, right? That's not so good
Yes.
for the company. So
But
I
it
can
also
see
sucks
both.
for the customers that can't find people because of these restrictive non-competes as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very, I mean, obviously it is a very nuanced issue, and it'll be interesting to see how this one winds its way through. So uh, honestly, though, I'm all for it because, to your point, if that person was thinking about leaving and they're enticed by whatever that offer is, then to me it's a sign that it wasn't a good fit for that person at your company, right? For whatever reason, through maybe no fault of your own, right? Like, but the fact that that other person is being lured away, there most people will get lured away for a good reason. So that means you just have to work that much harder to make sure you keep them, right?
Well, and
Um,
often they're not even lured away, right? Like I think that's almost, I know that happens, right? Especially with the highest quality people. But what's more common, especially in healthcare, is people that are just done working at that company, right? Like
right.
they don't like the culture, they don't like the team they're on, whatever reason, right? Or maybe they want to move. They want to go somewhere else, right? And they don't want to live in that cold area. They want to go somewhere warm, right?
Yeah.
Their husband's moving, right? Whatever, right? Like, and so, like you have these situations where that restricts them in a big way, where thousands of companies are out of commission and you're not allowed to work for them. And that's a real problematic. And, that goes to our next question is like, how do these non-competes hinder innovation, or do they, right? When I look at that, I think about what you just described. If the non-compete is keeping someone there because they can't go to another competitor, or even, a customer, etc. If that's keeping them there, do you want that employee? Right? Like, like they're not going to be doing their best work, right? They're not going to be delivering the same results. And so in many ways, when you look at the non-compete, you're probably keeping a bunch of people there that are going to be low performers. And then interestingly, do they fire them? Like you have to get so bad that you get fired so that then the non-compete doesn't apply. Although I think it still does. I'm not an expert on employment law. Anyway, like in that way, it hinders innovation at the company that it's at, let alone the fact that many of these innovative people who maybe want to go to a startup company that's going to enhance the existing vendor, right? Like they understand the vendor and they understand the holes of that vendor and they want to improve it. And they want to improve the life for the customers that they've been talking to. So on that side, I think it hinders innovation as well if you're not allowed to do a startup company that interacts with your original vendor.
Yeah, to me, this one's black and white. I do think non-competes hinder innovation for society as a whole, right? Like, I think that, in general, if you're preventing someone who's spent years or built up some knowledge in a specific space or around a certain solution, to hinder them from working at a company that's on a similar solution, or at a customer of theirs, to me, you're setting both companies back for no reason, right? You're losing an employee that you've invested in. That's sad and unfortunate. But now you're depriving a potential client or partner or some other player from that innovation that that person could bring, right? Which may have lifted the entire industry up, right? Or maybe it would have led to an even stronger relationship with that particular partner of yours. So I totally agree that this is hindering innovation. And especially in healthcare, we already have a challenge enough keeping people in our industry. Like
That's true.
we're not tech,
Yeah.
right? Like we're not the high tech industry.
Gotta
We're
want to
not
keep them.
we're not in the entertainment industry. Like so I think it further hinders innovation, because these people, where are they going to go? They're basically going to leave healthcare, right? Or they're going to go to a healthcare company where they have to relearn something new, and that sets everything back by another couple of years. So I totally feel that non-competes hinder innovation for sure.
Well, and it's frustrating because how often would someone that leaves a company go and create a competitive company? Certainly it happens in the smaller scale, right? So maybe at a startup, it even makes some sense to some degree since it's so new and you don't have the track record. But when you're a 5,000, 15,000 person company, like they don't usually go and try to compete with you, right? Like, an EHR vendor that has 5,000 employees or even 1,000 employees, right? Like, you're not going to go build your own EHR and start competing with Epic and Cerner and Meditech, right? Like, that's not the thinking. In most cases, they're going to go start a company that's going to enhance your existing ecosystem. And so I think that's where it's short-sighted as well when companies do the non-compete, because it's like these companies want to be all things to everyone, but they can't, right? Like
Right.
there's just too many problems in healthcare. That's why we've needed the APIs to be able to get access to, right? It's the same discussion. Like, oh, if we make APIs access available, what's going to happen? Like, well, they're not going to compete with you. They're going to enhance their product for your customers and make your customers even happier that they're using your product. So I think that's where non-competes fall out, and allowing for innovation where the company just doesn't have the bandwidth to solve some of these problems is where we're really missing out when a company is really aggressive in their non-compete.
Yeah, and then that was one thing I was going to say, John, about your earlier comment. I don't think a non-compete, especially these days, is what's anchoring an employee to a company. I mean, I think that's the last thing that employees think about is their non-compete. Like that's the reason to stay. Like if that's your only reason to stay, you got bigger problems, right? Yeah, and there's so much choice these days, right? Like some of these non-competes, especially the older written ones, are so narrow. Like all you would have to do, it's like it's like almost like a trademark, right? Like all you have to do is alter one little thing in the new company, and it's like, oh, well, we're not direct competitors, right? Or maybe the non-compete that you had at the time didn't include AI, and now you're going to go join another company that's doing AI, but that wasn't written in your contract, right? Like, uh, you know, what I'm saying is I don't think a non-compete keeps an employee. I don't think it's the golden handcuffs. I think it's more of the stability, the salaries, the fact that everyone you work with. Like I think those are more of the more powerful things that you stay, reasons why you stay. But I can see how it would prevent you from maybe looking at or even considering working for certain companies, right? Because why would you bring the ire of your former employer down on you, right? Like, so you'd look elsewhere. And again, going back to it, I think that does hinder innovation. We're losing that bright mind from furthering that particular area of healthcare.
Yep,
Hey, if
absolutely.
you're just tuning in and you're listening to Healthcare IT Today with John Lynn and Colin Hung. Today, we're talking about the problems and benefits of non-competes in healthcare. So, John, let me ask you this question. Are non-competes important for companies to protect their investment in employees? And, are they really that effective at doing that?
Yeah. And to me, it's an extension of what you were just talking about, right? And that you're right. Like, there's other reasons and push comes to shove, people get angry and just leave, right? Like, but there is this mental hurdle, right? That says, okay, well, if I have that EHR specific experience, where do I go? Where can I work? And in many cases, many of the EHR vendors right now are hiring young, you know, young people and training them up. And so that is the only experience they have. And so that's where I think it makes it challenging, where there's this mental hurdle that says, ooh, if I don't work for them and I can't work for all their customers, and some of them have gone so far as to create entire lists of companies that you're not allowed to go work at, customers and companies, which is fascinating. I mean, it's nice that at least they're transparent with it, but these are thousands and thousands of companies that you can't go work at who would actually be ideal in, targets for you to go work at. And so there is this mental barrier that says, can I go out on my own? There's a lot of them, in the EHR world that, which has been really aggressive. Some vendors have been with their non-compete, where they call it a gap year. They're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do a gap year. But instead of like going backpacking through Europe or whatever, they're doing, their gap year is just like trying to survive while they wait till they can get back, into the market again. And some of them have 2-year non-competes, which is, even harder to imagine. So it's an interesting balance for sure. But, I think that it does keep some employees around, but again, I think it keeps the wrong employees. And I think that's bad for your company.
I think in some cases, like when you're when you're the chief scientist of a company, or you're like the chief technology officer,
Yeah.
I do think that companies value the non-compete because it would protect their investment in someone like that at that level, right? That has that much knowledge, knows all the intimate
They've been
details
part of
of
the strategy of
exactly. So I can understand why a company would look at it and go, non-competes are important for people like that. I think when you go further down in the organization, it gets harder and harder to justify, like, why are you keeping this poor student handcuffed to you, preventing them from furthering their career, and they have to, forcing them to take these gap years. I think there can get a little ridiculous, right? And I don't think that's what even companies meant that non-compete to do, right? I don't think they would really want to harm a student, a new graduate, just because they work for them for 6 months from going on to another company to furthering their career, right? I also think it does hurt, or I think small companies do value the non-competes who don't have the means to enforce it, right? As you mentioned earlier, like as a startup, if I'm working on some, really innovative new technology, and I invested in a bunch, a couple of folks to maybe bring on as developers, you wouldn't want to have them suddenly leave and create a competing company to you that was directly competitive to you. And a non-compete can sometimes prevent that, right? Or at least delay them long enough so that original company can leap ahead again, right? So again, I do understand that for them, non-compete could be very important, but as a way to protect your investment, I think that's really short-sighted. Like if you're really that interested in protecting your IP and in your investment, there's other mechanisms for that. Like go apply for that patent, right? Because then you own that patent, and no matter if they go and create another company, you're like, great, give me the royalties, right? Like or don't sell it to them, right? Or you go after them through a proper legal channel to go at that IP. Or like as you said before, just make it so it's very enticing for them to stay, right?
Yep.
So yeah, I don't think I do think it's important in some sense, but I think in the majority of cases it's overblown in terms of how important it is to a company to protect their IP and then protect their investment in employees.
Well, and there are options like confidential information, trade secrets, and we see lawsuits, right, where someone goes to a competitor and they do that, right? And so there is some protection there. And you're right on the startups. There's some element of don't go and create a competitor, but probably even more so, poach someone off your large company that wants to compete with you, but isn't competing well, that wants to pick off and understand, really just pick you off to understand what you're doing so that they can replicate it or they can attack it or whatever. It's interesting. We see that in football, right? Where they might even bring someone in that was on the team that they're competing against, not because they actually want that person, but they want that person to tell you about the playbook of the other team. So It turns out it happens everywhere. Like this is like real stuff that could happen. And so you have to be careful for sure. But then it does give you, you do have other legal remedies beyond just the non-compete to do it. So, I think it does make some sense there, in that smaller level. At the larger company, to me, it's really hard to understand, especially when you think about, the investment in keeping the employees. I look at it a different way. and maybe this is because I'm in Vegas and Zappos is here in Vegas, they do something really interesting. After they train you on everything they do, which they have like a 2 week, 3 week training process, right? Where you're on the phones, you learn about culture, all this stuff. If at the end of that you don't want to stay there, they'll pay you to leave. So like they literally are like the opposite of a non-compete. They're like, hey, if you don't want to be here, we don't want you here either. So we're going to pay you to leave so that, we keep the people that are the right culture there because culture matters so much. So it's interesting to think about those two sides of it, right? Where it's like, I'm going to pay you to leave because I want to make sure we have the right people on the bus. It's probably a better strategy than, hey, I'm going to force you to stay here against your will, even though you want to leave. Yeah, that's a bad strategy for a business.
Yeah, like no one wants to leave a place that they enjoy working at, where they feel fulfilled, they feel valued. I mean, that's hard to find. And anybody who's switched jobs often will tell you those are some of the hardest values and hardest things to join a company, like to find in a new company. So as soon as you find that, those are that's a far better way to protect your investment, right? Like, and I'm not talking about perks and things like that. I'm talking about like really helping people to contribute at their top of their license or their top of their value or abilities. Like those are the things that you should invest in. And when you do that, people will stick around.
Is a non-compete a sign that your company sucks, right? Like if you're so aggressive with your non-competes, is that a sign that your culture sucks? And so I need a non-compete to keep you around, right? Like
Could be.
Shane,
It
okay,
could
I
be.
wonder if someone studied that.
Yeah, like I can imagine the chart, right? Is one sort of an inverse of the other. The more restrictive the non-compete, the worse the company culture is.
Yeah.
Who knows? That'll be an interesting study. But John, what do you think? Like, how do you think this, when it gets through the Supreme Court, or do you think this will impact healthcare? And where do you see non-competes playing now in healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of elements here. One is, in many ways, you look at what we pay for certain staff in healthcare, and we pay a lot more because the supply is restricted because of non-competes. And so, right now we're paying a lot for an Epic person, for a Cerner person, because there's so many restrictions. Okay, if we get rid of the non-compete, is that going to flood the market with more people, which interestingly will lower the cost of those people? I also saw an interesting study that said the opposite. It was arguing the opposite, that, hey, if you get rid of non-competes, then we're actually going to increase wages for all those people because they were working at a company where they couldn't go to the competitor, they couldn't go to whatever, a customer. But now that they can, they'll actually get a higher salary. And so then salaries will go up. So, from a macro perspective, it may go up. From a micro perspective, if I'm a hospital or health system, I'm saying, please get rid of the non-competes because I would happily have more people on the market and more supply of these experts available to me.
I think there's going to be an impact in one sense. And it goes back to what I've been talking about before. I think what this may do is at the very small end of the market. So if I'm a new entrepreneur creating a new company, I may delay hiring people, right? Because I don't want to bring on someone only to train them, only to have them leave. If I'm that paranoid or that fearful, I may delay my hiring. So in some way, it actually may hinder my timelines. It may slow me down in terms of how fast I'm going to bring my innovation to market. I also think it may change the way entrepreneurs farm out their work. I think you might see more compartmentalization, right? If I'm super paranoid about someone stealing my idea or running away with it, what I might do then is, if I'm a development shop, I might go, okay, well, you develop this one part, but then without parts 3, 4, and 5, you wouldn't be able to put this whole thing together. So I'll have a different team working on part number 3 and part number 4 and part number 5, and I'll hire them overseas, and I'll have a different groups, and and I'll cobble it together myself when all the parts are done. Like it may cause a different form of work if you're really, really working on something that you're very paranoid or very concerned about, leaking out into the market, or having just one person up and leave and replicating what you're doing. So I think it'll be interesting because it may change a little bit of the dynamics of work.
Yeah, that's fair. And the other angle that I think is interesting is, and we know who one of the biggest, non-compete people is, Epic, right? How many more companies would there be that would support the Epic ecosystem if they didn't have a non-compete? I think that's worthy of consideration. Certainly there's a few, right? Like we know Nordic Consulting came out, the Epic Redox that came from some Epic people, that there's a number of standout ones there. But it's like, how many more would there be if people didn't have to wait the 2 years? Because let's be frank, we know the numbers in healthcare. They can't even pay their medical bills. So how are they going to be able to, survive 1 to 2 years with no income or working in another industry or whatever, right? Like that's a challenging thing for an entrepreneur to overcome. But if they didn't have that, right? If they could just, do the work, then would we see a whole ecosystem of companies that support and enhance Epic, Cerner, Meditech? Let's throw them all in there, right? I think we would, right? And I think that would be a good impact for healthcare, because no doubt there's thousands of gaps in everything that healthcare is doing that these entrepreneurs could go and fill.
Yeah, I totally agree. All you have to do is look over at the world of SAP and the ecosystem that surrounds that
Yeah,
company, right? And
Salesforce.
how large it is, right? And in fact, as you put it, that ecosystem essentially reinforces the near monopoly that SAP has in the ERP world, right? Like, because there's just so many consulting companies, so many supportive organizations of that ecosystem, you can't help but go, well, I just sign up for the SAP because I need all these other pieces to it. So could the same thing happen here in the R world? For sure, I could totally see that. But it's interesting to kind of rewind back the tape and go, well, what happens if there was no non-compete back when Epic was smaller?
Yeah.
Would we now have 40 strong EHRs rather than a smaller number? Or would Epic now be more in the acquisition world, right? Gobbling up some of these competitors that may have sprung up from some of their former employees? Equally a good thing, right? Like,
I was gonna say, I think 40 other Epics would actually be a good thing. Like
yeah,
it's not a good thing for Epic and their shareholders, but it's good for the ecosystem in general. Competition's generally good.
yeah. So I mean, it's interesting to think about. It's sort of an interesting exercise to run through. Hopefully that world of no non-competes is going to arrive soon. But I agree with you with what you said at the top, John. I think it's going to take a little bit of time before we get to there.
Yeah, but it's worth considering now. What are the other things you could put in place if it does get enacted?
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's the message from this episode. Make sure that the non-compete is not the only reason why your employees are staying with you. Hey, listen, thanks to all of you who tuned into this episode of Healthcare IT Today. Find out more details about our show by checking out the programs page at healthcarenowradio.com. And please share your voice and engage with the community at healthcareittoday.com and on social media using the hashtag HITSM. I'm Colin Hung, along with my health IT collaborator, John Lin. Thanks for listening, and we'll have a great week.